Fleet Commander. Mrs. Muck, Trapper John, with between horses Auction Law, and finally Ikdam. And they swing left-handed. Pertemps Network back in the lead now, and Peter Scudamore going over to the rails the shortest way now as he does so. Fleet Commander is second. Trapper John, Auction Law, and Mrs. Muck, not a lot between them, just in behind. And Ikdam is sixth, with the riderless Shieldgrove Place just being led back there by Joe O'Gorman, both okay. And Pertemps Network, the leader from on the inside, Fleet Commander. Trapper John is third, Auction Law 5, Mrs. Muck 6, and Ikdam 7, but not a lot between first and last as they jump the 7th, and there wasn't much between Fleet Commander and Pertemps Network, with Trapper John going well in third, then Mrs. Muck and Peter Scudamore going back towards the outside, looking for the better ground on Pertemps Network as they race towards the next. Number 8, Pertemps Network on the outside. Fleet Commander, not quite such a good jump there by Trapper John. Auction Law and Mrs. Muck very close in behind, and then Ikdam. As they race towards this one, 4 from home. Fleet Commander on the right of the picture with his white face jumps it second to Pertemps Network, but loses a lot of ground there, and it's Pertemps Network going on from Mrs. Muck, who's cruising in second now, just on the outside of Trapper John for Ireland. Auction Law 4, 5 is Ikdam, and then Fleet Commander, who's lost a lot of ground. Pertemps Network, the leader from Mrs. Muck, and Trapper John, as they've got 3 to jump now in this Mandor Flexible Doors Premier Long Distance Hurdle. Peter Scudamore in the lead on Pertemps Network from Mrs. Muck and Graham Bradley, with Charlie Swan on Trapper John for Allen still very much in contention, and Ikdam making quite significant progress in 4th place. Pertemps Network coming down to the 3rd last flight, lands in the lead. Pertemps Network coming down now towards the 2nd last. Pertemps Network being pressed by Trapper John over on the far side, and Mrs. Muck between horses. Then comes Ikdam racing to the 2nd last now. Mrs. Muck from Pertemps Network and Trapper John over on the far side. Mrs. Muck lands in the lead from Pertemps Network. Trapper John racing down now towards the final flight, and Mrs. Muck has sailed into the lead now. Mrs. Muck going away from Trapper John over on the far side as they come to the last. Mrs. Muck about 3 clear, jumps it well. Trapper John jumps it second. Mrs. Muck and Graham Bradley going away from Trapper John and Pertemps Network, and Mrs. Muck holding Trapper John. Trapper John still challenging, but Mrs. Muck galloping on strongly. She's going to win it all right. Mrs. Muck striding up towards the line to become number 12 of the season for Graham Bradley at the line. Mrs. Muck is the winner. 2nd is Trapper John. 3rd is Pertemps Network, and 4 Ikdam. That's the 1, 2, 3, 4 in the opener on Peter Marsh Day at Haydock this afternoon. First, number 7, Mrs. Muck, owned by Mr. Nigel Twiston Davis, trained by him and ridden by Graham Bradley. 2nd was number 3, Trapper John, owned by Mrs. Jill Fanning, trained by Mouse Morris and ridden by Charlie Swan. And 3rd was number 2, Pertemps Network, owned by Pertemps Limited, trained by Martin Pipe and ridden by Peter Scudamore. 4th was number 1, Ikdam. This is the winner, her 10th success in 35 runs.